Hello, I'm Simon Jones, Director of Extraction Protocol. This video is going to be something of an enhanced commentary track for the short, including a bunch of visual effects breakdowns and other behind the scenes info. Okay, so let's get on with it. We've already done a tutorial on these opening titles. There should be a link to it on the screen right now. It was particularly fun taking the normal HitFilm ident and putting it in a completely new context. The title was created entirely in HitFilm using the particle engine. Check out the tutorial for more info. This opening shot was the first shot I attempted once we got into post. I'd expected it to be one of the trickiest shots in the film, but it turned out to be surprisingly easy. After it was tracked in FXhome, it was a relatively simple matter of dropping in a bunch of stock images to create the background. My favourite aspect of the shot is the use of the fluffy cloud preset to give it a sense of atmospheric depth. Really simple, but works really well. Again, we've got an in-depth tutorial on the channel, so check that out if you want to know more. For the HUD shots, I created the main overlay just once, which I could then reuse for all the different HUD shots. I did want to have the HUD a bit more active, with the energy bars and the radar behaving as you'd expect as the camera moved around, but unfortunately the project schedule didn't quite allow for that extra level of detail. It's all possible in HitFilm, of course, it just depends how much time and resources you have. The access panel here was built by prop master Nigel Clegg, and was mounted on top of the door's real card scanner, which looked far too boring. The red screen that turns green later on once it's hacked was composited in afterwards. I actually started work on this shot before motion tracking was added to HitFilm Ultimate in the 1.1 update, so it needed quite a bit of hand animation. The hacking dials were created entirely in HitFilm using a mixture of mask shapes. These could then be dropped in as embedded composite shots wherever I wanted them. The blue beams linking each of the hacking nodes was actually created using HitFilm Ultimate's lightning effect. As we recently covered in the laser bolt tutorial, all you need to do is drop the wave and twitch properties down to 0 to get a nice straight line. Although this shot didn't require any visual effects, I did run it through HitFilm's stabilizer. When we shot this scene, the rain was coming in fast, so we didn't have as much time to set up as we wanted, and had to run and gun it a little bit. The result was a few shots that were a bit more handheld than I wanted, but with a bit of stabilization they worked out just fine. Right at the end of post-production, my DP Ross Turner suggested adding some additional lens flares throughout the film. It was a good idea and helped to tie the visual style together with the glowing atrium at the end. I initially thought it was going to be a tricky, awkward process, but again the 2D motion tracking in HitFilm Ultimate made it really easy. In this shot, for example, I simply tracked the real lights that were in the shot and then parented the light flare positions to the tracked points. Easy. I'll talk more about the X-ray vision later on. This is probably the shot I'm least satisfied with in the film. It's a bit too brief and a bit too handheld to get a good look at the mercs and the annotations. As with the door hacking at the start, any veteran Deus Ex fans out there will get a few bonus references hidden away in there. This shot was a nice challenge. I've done invisibility a whole load of times before, so that side of things wasn't difficult. We've actually already done a tutorial on it last year, which is worth checking out. The challenge here, as with most of Extraction Protocol, was keeping the camera moving while doing these kind of shots. So we shot 2 passes, one with the actor and one without. This enabled me to then isolate him and composite him back into the shot. The tricky bit was keeping the camera move roughly the same for both passes, but it worked out pretty good. The most important thing is that it feels like he's still physically in the scene. As you might have noticed, the hacking screens are used mainly to divulge basic plot information, rather than using dialogue. So in this shot you find out, for example, that the agent is looking for a hostage, which we'll then cut to in a couple of shots. Now this invisibility shot was a bit of a weird one, in that it was never storyboarded or actually planned. Josh Davies was operating the second camera for this scene, and suggested setting up behind the counter to see the agent moving past. I was focusing on the main shot, so I didn't pay too much attention at the time. Once we got into the edit though, the shot worked really nicely, especially as it ended on the computer screen, which gave a natural exit from the scene. However, there was a big complication in that I didn't actually have a clean plate of the shot, which would then make it tricky to make the actor see through. Additionally, some of the camera crew could be glimpsed at a few spots during the take. The solution was satisfyingly sneaky. In between takes, Josh would of course reset his camera on the glide track back into the starting position. It just so happened that one of these resets didn't have anybody else in it. That meant I could simply play the shot in reverse to make the camera move from right to left, giving me a perfect clean plate that I could then composite the actor into. I've always been rather fond of shots that turn out nicely, but which behind the scenes have a really convoluted history. Grading is a hugely important part of any film, but that's even more the case when you're working on a very tight budget and schedule that doesn't afford you ideal lighting setups. This scene is probably the best example in Extraction Protocol. Compare this finished shot, for example, with the raw footage. You can see that the original is far less dramatic and doesn't have any sense of threat. Using heavy vignetting helps to draw the viewer into the important focal points, the hostage and the hostage taker in this case, and gives the room an appropriately decrepit, threatening appearance. This X-ray shot is one of my favourites in the film. It was a tricky one to camera track due to not having many obvious tracking features, but once that was done it was actually relatively simple to get the two X-ray shots into place. In the scene here you can see them arranged in 3D to vaguely simulate the hostage room. This was partly why I spent 3 shots establishing the layout of the room, with the position of the hostage on the chair and the gunman leaning against the wall. Without establishing that clearly in the previous few shots, this X-ray shot could be very abstract indeed. The green screen plates were actually very simple. We didn't do any movement on them at all. If the shot was 100% accurate, the camera should really have moved from the side to in front, like in the corridor shot itself. Instead we just shot flat plates, but the illusion works fine, mainly due to the shimmery hologram appearance that kind of disguises what's going on. To get that look I used a variety of grading techniques. First up I keyed out the actor with a simple colour difference key. I made this keyed version into its own composite shot, so that I could reuse it whenever I wanted. To the keyed version I then added a tint effect, setting it to the iconic Deus Exi burnt orange that is used in all the HUD stuff throughout Extraction Protocol. This creates a nice solid silhouette, but I only wanted an outline. To create this, I used a simple but very effective little trick. First, I duplicated the tinted layer and changed the tint to black. Then I added a matte cleaner effect. Now you'd normally use the matte cleaner to help tidy up a green screen composite, but in this case I was able to use the choke property to crop in the edge of the key. The result was a choked black version of the layer sitting on top of the orange layer, creating the illusion of an outline. It's quite a handy technique that could be useful for all kinds of stylish visuals, particularly if you're into your motion graphics. Okay, in a new comp I then took a black plane, added a fine grid, then used the keyed actor layer as a displacement source. You can see the actor's shape in the grid here. A fisheye warp was used to give the grid lines a bit more curvature. A set matte effect was then used to restrict the plane layer to the same matte as the keyed layer, removing all the extra grid lines. You can find a bit more detail on some of these techniques in the invisibility tutorial we did last year. A neon glow effect was used to give the lines a soft outline, and then TV damage and scan lines were used to create the glitchy, low-res UI appearance. The same techniques were then used on all the other X-ray elements as well. Now the wall break was one of the more difficult shots in the film. It breaks down something like this. Our actors were shot against a green screen, individually and together. To begin with, I used the plate of Ed on his own. This was composited onto a completely CG wall. The wall was constructed using simple planes. First there was a light grey plane with a subtle cloud texture effect. Then a brighter plane was masked to be very thin and positioned in the same place as the crack in the real on-location wall. A darker duplicate of this line was then placed just to its left, which creates the illusion of it being an indented line. The whole wall was darkened down to match the real version, with a shadowed area to the left. The whole thing was then blurred ever so slightly, so that it wasn't quite so crisp and would match the footage more. Once Ed was composited on, some shadows were needed to roughly match the on-location shot. The shadow layers were created by duplicating the keyed actor, dropping it down to be completely black, and then adjusting the blur and opacity settings appropriately. 3 shadows were actually used, a quad warped version stretching quite a distance away, a lighter shadow closer to the actor's body, and then a very subtle ambient occlusion shadow that sits right behind the actor layer. It's barely noticeable, but really helps to make it look like the actor is up against the wall. Compare it to this version without it. The wall was then set up in 3D space, with another wall representing the outside corridor positioned a little further back. The wall break itself was a heavy-duty particle simulation. It was a mixture of large brick chunks and thick dust. I also broke up the wall plane itself into larger wall pieces that I then animated to fly past the camera. Once the dust had filled the screen, I then swapped out the shot of Ed on his own to the shot with both Ed and Christopher in the same shot. I went to quite some effort to make it all work as a single continuous shot, which I thought would help sell it, but in the final edit the shot is actually cut into 2. Although it's sometimes painful to cut out visual effects shots that you spent ages working on, it's important to remember that the overall film is the only thing that matters. In this case, I felt that cutting to Kira's reaction was more effective than staying on the wall break shot. The actual hole in the wall was created as a separate plate by Josh, It was put together in Photoshop, then imported and comped in as required. Here's something I'm not particularly happy about. We were working to a very tight schedule and unusually strict constraints in this particular location. The original storyboards had the characters emerging from a door on the walkway, but come the shooting day, it turned out that we weren't actually allowed to go through that particular door. As a result, we didn't get a decent entry point to the scene, which is why there's this slightly lame establishing shot, followed by them just randomly standing by the closed door. But these things happen with filmmaking, and you just have to make the best of it and work around it in the edit. So this neon wall was created entirely in post. While the location itself was very cool, it didn't quite have the sci-fi grandeur that I wanted. The Deus Ex Human Revolution computer game has an abundance of neon strip lighting in very unusual configurations, so this was a little nod to that design sensibility. I gave it a quick try on this shot, and it really helped to give it more visual interest. Okay, here we have our first CG lenses shot. The props built by Nigel Clegg were designed to work with or without lenses. They weren't able to do the actual lens motion, of course, so that was done entirely in HIT film. Throughout this whole shot, the lenses are all CG. Also, oh, hi, there's our cinematographer Ross Turner with his little accidental cameo there. Moving swiftly on. First up, I tracked Christopher's face, using the eyepiece props. Once each eye was tracked, I created a black plane that was masked to the correct shape and parented to the tracked point. This kept it mostly in place, and only minimal keyframing was required to tweak the shapes over time. This is a really good example of how useful HIT film's built-in motion blur can be. Here's the shot without any motion blur. Notice how the lenses look obviously stuck on and unrealistic, especially once Christopher starts to turn his head. Turn motion blur on without making any other adjustments, and the lenses instantly look much more convincing, matching the blur that was found in the original live-action shot. An additional mask set to subtract mode was animated to move over the lens shape. This gradually reveals the lens, creating the illusion of it slotting into place. This next shot actually has fully CG lenses as well. I had initially planned to have this be the shot where the lenses appear, but it was a bit flat and the lens effects were so subtle that most people didn't even notice them. From this shot onwards, however, the lenses are actually real lenses. Now, in this shot you can see the flaw in my plan of augmenting the location with some cool neon sci-fi strip lighting. Thing is, once you've established something in one shot, turns out you're supposed to keep it in subsequent shots. Who knew? So, all of these shots require the same enhancements. Mix this in with varying levels of handheld camera work, actors and scenery moving in front of the neon wall, and you've got a bunch of shots that are slightly more tricky than the original establishing shot. Still, it does serve to enhance the scene, so I think it was probably worth the pain in the end. The neon strips were created with simple masked planes and the neon glow effect. A flicker was also added to give them a slight thrumming vibrancy. And yes, I'm pretty sure thrumming vibrancy is the technical term. This is quite an effective shot, but it's actually pretty simple. It makes use of a whole bunch of Action Essentials 2 stock from Video Copilot, as well as a generous use of the shake effect in HIT film. Fairly simple, but nicely effective. The Icarus Jump was something I wanted to include right from the start of the project. I knew it would be tricky, but it's an iconic part of the game, and would be a nice challenge to pull off in HIT film. This first shot we simply had Christopher jump up and out of frame, without actually jumping over the edge, although you can never be entirely sure what a stuntman is going to do. As you can see, this shot was actually much longer originally, and you can see Christopher leaping over the glass walkway. It was an interesting compositing challenge, but again was something that was cut for pacing. The whole leap and fall looked so much better when cut tight and fast. Chris was shot separately on a green screen and then composited into the shot. The main element, of course, was the energy ball itself. The ball started off as a yellow plane. A couple of masks were used to turn it into a circle and to cut a hole in the middle so that it looked more spherical. The clouds effect was then used to add some texture. This is a trick I use quite a lot as it's a really quick and easy method. A fisheye warp was used to give it a more curved surface, and a mixture of exposure, tint and crushed blacks and whites gave it the final appearance. The ball was also then used as a displacement source layer. This distorts the video layer underneath, again helping it to give the impression of the ball being a sphere rather than a flat circle. A particle simulator was added, timed to burst out in a shower of sparks as the ball popped into existence. The sparks are quite subtle, but help to give the effect a bit more dynamism and physicality. Now the landing was fun to piece together. We shot 2 plates, one with the guards and one with our hero. In an ideal world we'd have had Christopher up on a wire rig so that we could actually drop him into place for real, but that wasn't an option on our budget. This meant that we didn't really have a way to physically drop him into the shot. The solution was to shoot it as separate plates, so that Christopher could jump off a table, giving us realistic movement and impact. The table was then removed, and Christopher's movement was corrected so that he drops down from the ceiling right into the centre of the 2 guards. However, even though it's a composite, because they were both shot on location, they match up absolutely perfectly. The ball itself was created using the same techniques as in the earlier shot, and the sparks were carried through to this shot with a deflector added so that they could impact on the floor. The impact explosion was created using a particle simulator for the large sparks, and the lightning effect for the glowing cracks that shoot out over the floor. A shockwave was also added for the impact, timed to expand outwards with the guards falling over. Sketchwork TV actually have a really neat little tutorial for creating a good shockwave over on their channel, so make sure you check that out. The arm blade shot was also split down into separate plates. First we got the guards reacting on the floor, and then we shot the hero stabbing downwards with the weapons. This enabled the movement to be violent and the blades to impact into the guards' bodies without actually injuring any of our actors or requiring really complex props. The revealing of the blades was accomplished simply by masking them out at the start of the shot, then gradually revealing them over a few frames. You can actually see the mask shifting a little in this shot, which is annoying. It's a mistake that could have been easily fixed with a spot of colour correction, but it wasn't identified until it was too late and the film was already out. It's subtle enough that it hopefully doesn't spoil anybody's enjoyment of the film. The blood is stock footage, again from Action Essentials 2. It's perhaps not entirely realistic, but I rather like the exaggerated spurtiness of it. This shot also features some of the CG lens flares that were added throughout the film. They really help to give it a more distinct visual style. Now, there's a slight art department fail in this shot, as for some reason we have a bunch of entirely random items in front of the elevator doors. A load of brochures, a rubbish bin, a few pot plants. Not quite sure what happened there. It was right at the end of the time we had been given to shoot in this location, but it does look a bit weird. The lenses in this shot are entirely CG again, and disappear using the same techniques used earlier to make them appear. This final shot was originally conceived to have the hero walking off into the distance down the street, but various factors meant we weren't able to get this shot with the actor. I suppose, given that the character has invisibility, it could be that he's actually in the shot, but was already turned invisible. Yeah, I think I'll go with that as the explanation. This shot was heavily tweaked from the original, which was just an ordinary street. The shot was extensively tracked so that the buildings could be added, and the additional lights. The monorail is actually just a pedestrian walkway, but with some lights and sparks from a moving train, it worked quite nicely as an overhead. The flying cars were done in a very basic way. They're just still images animated to move about in the background. The main thing to sell the shot was to get the lighting to all match up. So if you look at the shadows on the live action shot and the comped buildings, you can see that the light is more or less coming from the same direction. Going for the blown out, overexposed style also helps to blur the line between the real and CG elements. And that just about covers how we put Extraction Protocol together. Hopefully this was useful and informative. We've got lots more cool videos coming up, including in-depth tutorials, so stay tuned. Make sure you subscribe if you don't want to miss a thing. See you next time.